think the mistake we made, Democrats and Republicans both in the United States, is we just thought they were gonna become democratic and that it was the end of history, as my colleague here at Stanford, Frank Fukuyama, wrote very famously at the time. So we didn't invest into trying to make that happen. We just thought it was going to happen organically. Very different from what we did in World War II. We occupied Germany, we occupied Japan to help them build their democratic institutions. The reason we did that in 45 and we didn't in 91, 92 is because in 45 there was a lingering threat called the Soviet Union.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. It is the fall of 1962. John Kennedy is the president, and the meetings in the White House over these last days have been in a crisis mode. We know it now as the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, it has lessons in it that here, all these decades later, we can review because of the concern that we're in a new Cold War 2.0, and review because we're not in the same predicament. There's a third player on the field, the People's Republic of China. I learned this again and again with lessons learned and things to know from a new book by Michael McFaul, the distinguished professor who is the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute on the Stanford campus, also at the Hoover Institution. The book is Autocrats versus Democrats: China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. Michael, a very good evening to you. Thank you, Professor, for joining. Immediately to October, November 1962, Jack Kennedy is faced with information that the Soviets under Nikita Khrushchev have placed medium-range missiles with the possibility of delivering nuclear weapon warheads into Cuba, and what is to be done. That was a crisis at the time that you and your reporting correctly identify as one of the worst, if not the worst moment in the Cold War. What did we learn then? What do we know now about that confrontation that helps us here in the 21st century? Good evening, Professor.
Well, good evening, and thanks for having me, John. Good to see you again. I think it's a great place to start because it was, in my view, one of the most dangerous, probably the most dangerous moment in the Cold War. And obviously, we still call it the Cold War historically because it didn't become a hot war between the United States and the Soviet Union, even though they did fight from time to time proxy wars. But that was a major crisis because, of course, it involved nuclear weapons. And the use of nuclear weapons means complete obliteration of both countries involved, and lots of other countries would be affected by it. And when I looked again at it, I'd studied the Cuban Missile Crisis before, I taught it. But when I went back and looked at that period again for this book, one thing that was very striking to me was how bad our communications were, how we were making guesses about the intentions of the other side, both in Moscow and Washington. And rightfully so, after that, both governments learned to set up crisis management mechanisms, crisis prevention, symbolized by this red phone, the hotline, so that there could be direct communication. But that was just a symbol for a lot of things that happened afterwards to try to get to know each other better. Arms control ensued after that, and it didn't slow down the number of arms, but we learned about each other's nuclear arsenals. And through that learning process, that was a stabilizing process. And I think that's a very important lesson for dealing with both Russia and China, but especially China today. When I was the US ambassador in Moscow, I used to always say to my team, we're going to have a lot of conflicts and disagreements with Putin today. He came back as president in 2012, right when I became the US ambassador. But we can never have a disagreement with this government based on bad information or an incorrect reading of their intentions. And when I look at U.S.-China relations especially, because that's the most dangerous in the long term, in my view, the connectivity that we have is just not what it was during the Cold War. And I think that is an important lesson that we should get back to. It doesn't mean we're going to agree with them. It doesn't mean by having meetings with them that we legitimate their regime. Nobody should make any of those mistakes. But crisis management and crisis prevention is something we learned out of the Cold War and something I think we need to do again in dealing with China and Russia today.
At that moment, 1962, it is assumed by those of us who are young people, I was certainly a teenager, that the world was looking to the United States and the President of the United States for leadership in the face of the dictatorship of Russia and its allies. And Russia did have a few allies, although they were all under the Soviet boot at the time,
Yes.
Eastern Europe. So that 1962 represents the golden years of the democracy. The reason I bring this up is that Michael asked a very good question at the beginning of his book. How did we go from euphoria about democracy and globalization? That would be 1962. And the West, 3 decades later, 3 decades ago, and how did we go to uncertainty about democracy, doubt about liberal and international disorder, and fear of powerful autocracies today? In other words, everything was ours, including the well wishes of the world in 1962. Here we are in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, and there's nothing but doubt all around us. It's a really good question, Michael. So I want to go one more time at that moment in 1962. China was not on the field.
Right.
China was a broken country, and it was very difficult to see, I think. There was no transparency. However, it was ruled autocratically by, by Mao Zedong and his lieutenants. Can we regard those autocrats, along with Vladimir Putin, as threatening the United States, even though we couldn't see it at the time? Were they a threat as well?
They were, and I'm glad you brought that up because if you were measuring power with metrics that we use to measure power, uh, the PRC under Mao was not a powerful country. You're absolutely right about that. But what they were, they had a leader with a lot of intentionality. So it's will and way, right? He didn't have the same capabilities as the Soviet Union, but I would argue that he was a much more revolutionary, revisionist leader than most certainly Khrushchev and Brezhnev were. Go back a decade before 1962. They barely had a country. They had a civil war for a long time. They seized power as a communist dictatorship in 1949. And the next year, literally the next year, they fight us in Korea. And I think there's a parallel there thinking about Putin's Russia versus communist China today. So Putin's Russia today is not as powerful as China on by all metrics. And yet, because Putin has this will of revisionism, I would call it imperialism, he's using his limited capabilities actually in more destabilizing ways than the Chinese are today. And I think that comparison between the Soviet Union back in the 50s and 60s, more power, but not as crazy. Let's just be, as Mao was, to take on. I mean, we had a hot war with the Chinese communists on the Korean Peninsula. And that was because that his ideas and his leadership pushed us in that way. And that sometimes gets not as much as attention in academia and in foreign policy making as I think it should.
Also important, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin were also young men at the time. They were
Mm.
schoolboys. However, they were absorbing the lessons of their country. Xi, because what we were looking at is the early days of the Cultural Revolution, which was a nightmare. And his father was repressed, though his father was a Princeton member of the leadership in the Communist Party. And Putin was outside the circle of everything, except for he bore with him the resentment of what had happened to Russia during the Second War. That's their childhood. We go now
Yes.
to a good incident that happens later with China. These are promising moments, but they're critical moments as well to help me understand autocrats versus democrats, China, Russia, America, and the new global disorder by Michael McFaul. Next, Tiananmen Square, June 1989. There's a lot of detail here, but it comes to the fact that on camera, we saw the Chinese Communist Party direct its army to be cruel and violent and murderous. The opportunity at that point was that the Soviet Union was deeply troubled and would fall apart while Michael was there in 90 and 91. The Chinese Communist Party thought it too was vulnerable to such a uprising from the bottom, and they crushed those students. George H.W. Bush was the president, and he made a decision. The decision was to reach out with an open hand. Why did he do that, and what did we learn from it, Michael?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was a tragic moment in American foreign policy history. I understand it, and the argument for doing that by the Bush administration is that we needed the Chinese to balance against the Soviet Union. That was started by Nixon and Kissinger, and the idea we helped to pull them away. Now the split, I want to emphasize, the split between the Soviets and the Chinese communists happened well before then. We didn't cause it. And I think there's some misunderstanding of that in terms of people dreaming about peeling the Russians away from the Chinese today. But that was the theory of the case. That's why we needed them. And that was the opening, in terms of economic engagement that was happening during that period. I just think they could have handled it a little differently. I don't, at that point, 1989, nobody had to worry about the Soviet Union. As you just said, they were in a period of retreat and later collapse just 2 years later. I think one should, I liked actually the way that President Reagan talked about dealing with autocrats. And I think it would have been a better formula here. And it's all in George Shultz's memoirs. He was a mentor of mine here at the Hoover Institution. He wrote I think, the best memoir ever about diplomacy. It's really long, so maybe that's why people haven't read it. But he speaks very explicitly in that book about the need to engage with dictators. And remember, Schultz came in 1982, 2 years after President Reagan had won the election, when there was hardly any conversation with the Soviets. And he comes in and says, well, we got to talk to these people because we have issues with them, particularly about nuclear weapons. But he's made it very explicit, and he was well known for this, is that when we're talking to them, we're not going to check our values at the door, and we're not going to let them dictate what the agenda is. And so George, when he would meet with his Soviet counterparts, and I presume Chinese counterparts, but I know the story about the Soviet Union better, he would talk about nuclear weapons and things they wanted to talk about, but then he also brought up human rights. He also brought up, for instance, opening a consulate in Ukraine because he wanted more connectivity with people in Ukraine. And I just think that dual track diplomacy that we talk about security things, but values, I think that would have been a better way to approach it. It doesn't mean we were going to help democratize China in 1989. I'm not naive enough to believe that. But looking away, I think, did damage to our reputation at the time.
The conversation initially was between representative of the president, that would be Brent Scowcroft, the lieutenant general. I believe
Yes.
Mr. Eagleberger was with him. They had a conversation in the summertime and again in the winter, I believe, December, near to at the end of the year. And Deng Xiaoping, the big boss at the time, made a compromise as well. He committed himself to a form of capitalism. Was that an opportunity for us? Did we take that opportunity to build more institutions of democracy into China, or did we do hands off? We're just gonna worry about the China price.
Again, it's a complicated, great question. And John, you really know your history. I'm deeply impressed. Many of the references you're making are not in my book, just so everybody knows. My original book, by the way, was 1,200 pages
Yes,
long
I know, Michael.
because I had to, my editor made me get it down to 500.
I know, and I often felt, well, let's keep going here, Michael.
Yeah, maybe another time, another
You
book.
did speak of Tiananmen, though. You gave me an
Yeah,
open.
yeah. Tendency in the book. But you're asking one of the most fundamental questions about the nature of our relationship with China and Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He did make those concessions, and he did open up the Chinese economy to the West, including the United States. And let's be clear, American companies made billions and billions and billions of dollars and continue to do so because of that opening. And that was good for American capitalism, and it was good for Chinese economic growth. 4 decades of growth unprecedented in world history. There was a theory, and I don't know if people really believed it. I hesitate, right? Because I was not around working in the government. But most certainly, our leaders were saying economic growth and economic modernization will eventually create the permissive conditions for democratization. Uh, the Bush presidents talked that way. Bill Clinton talked that way. And I don't know if they really believed it or not, but it didn't work. It didn't work out that way. And today, China is one of the most successful economies in the world, the most successful economy in the world, I would argue, that is ruled by a by a dictatorship. I took out the word communist because actually, with regard to the economy, it's a mixed system these days. And that part we got wrong. Now, whether we did that intentionally or we just wanted to look the other way so our companies could make profits, that part I do not know the answer to.
The challenge here is to understand that moment in time. So when it comes the next time, we'll have a background story. And
Yes,
one more detail here. The alternative looked at the time, looking at the headlines, to be chaos in China,
yes.
danger to the billion citizens and to the whole region. Uh, when we have that choice again, and we had it in 1991 when you were in Moscow, and we're going there now, it was the same challenge. And it'll come again, Michael. Did we learn anything? We have about a minute. Did we learn anything about that choice? We chose peace in both instances.
Well, we chose peace. That was the right choice in both places. And chaos and breakdown is not in our national interest, especially when you're dealing with a country like the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. But I think in retrospect, we were too complacent. We thought
Yeah.
the whole world wanted to be democracy and we didn't have to do anything about it. I think had we leaned in more in the early 90s, especially with political assistance that they wanted and economic assistance as they went through a depression, we might have helped consolidated that regime like we did after World War II with Germany, Japan, and Italy.
It's 1990-91, and a young graduate student named Michael McFaul is in Moscow while the whole world is watching an experiment by a man named Mikhail Gorbachev, who inherits the big boss role of the Soviet Communist Party because of the deaths of three very aged and very unchanging men. They're gone. Gorbachev is in charge, and he's got ideas, glasnost and perestroika. That translates into reaching out to the United States. There's a background to this. And before we plunge into what happened in Moscow in 1990, 91, Michael, détente, 1972, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev. Is that now considered a success when you reflect upon dealing with autocrats?
That's a great question. I think it's a very contested debate in my world. Some people blame that period for prolonging the Soviet Union. I don't. I think it was a successful policy for the at the time to advance American national interests, and I always like to emphasize that your job when you work for the United States of America in the U.S. government is to advance our national interest, our security, our prosperity, our values, not other countries. And I think that was a wise strategy at the time. I think there's some lessons from that period for how to deal with the Chinese today. Maybe we went a little too far, in my view, in not speaking about human rights issues during that period. That was kind of off the table. I think you can do both. I kind of like the way the Reagan folks did it later. But I think it was a useful time in stabilizing relations between two superpowers and lessening the probability of a war between two nuclear powers.
The joke I've always enjoyed at the moment, there's so many, is when Brezhnev gives a tour of his cars that some of the vehicles came from Richard Nixon as presidents to Brezhnev, who loved to drive them.
Ah,
Showed him to his mother at the Kremlin. This is a joke. And she watched him be so proud of his Cadillac. And she started to weep. And he said, Mama, Mama, why are you weeping? She said, Oh, Leonid, what if the Reds come back? And so That was the temperament of 1972. We now
Yes.
go to 1990, 91, when you were there. This is dealing with a country that's crumbling all around you. Did you see the end of the Soviet Union coming? Could you feel it in the streets of Moscow, Michael?
Yes, I did. In fact, I wrote a piece in the summer of 1990 in the San Jose Mercury News because I was a young guy and I couldn't get it published at other places, but it compared the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, to what I was calling the Soviet Revolution at the time. This is a year before, year and a half before the collapse, because I saw these patterns. This book by Crane Britton called Anatomy of Revolution had a big impact on me at the time, and I was seeing the phases. And the initial phase of reform under Gorbachev, I predicted was going to lead to a more radical phase. And then the Jacobins would come in, and they did. That's the Yeltsin era. And then there would be a counter-revolution, as there oftentimes is. The Thermidor, as we called it in the French Revolution. I didn't know the name of the person, but in France it was Napoleon. In the Bolshevik Revolution it was Stalin. And in the Russian Revolution, it turned out to be Vladimir Putin. But in 1990, 91, I knew this, it felt like a revolutionary moment for me. But we don't know how revolutions end, right? The collapse of the old order, the ancient regime, doesn't mean we know how to predict what happens later. And it felt so much that way that I wrote a book. It's not a book actually, it's a Hoover publication, which was a series of interviews, John, where I interviewed all the leaders from the liberals to the communists to the nationalists to the fascists, because I wanted to capture that moment in history that in the archives so that when people go and study what happened, they would feel that moment of uncertainty as I did back in 1990, 91.
Did you feel personally at risk when you learned of the coup attempt that summer against Gorbachev? Americans, were they warned to start packing?
Well, I left in June of 1991 and then came back in October of 1991. So
Hmm.
I was not there for the 3 days of the coup, but I'll tell you, as I was driving out, my last meeting with my academic advisor, Moscow State University, Apollon Davidson is his name. He was an African specialist because I was there doing research on my dissertation, but I got pulled in to working with the small d Democrats, and I make no apologies for that. It was a very exciting time. And as I was going to the airport, literally that day, I said, I'll see you in the fall because I'd planned to come back. And he said, Mr. McFaul, you'll never be let back in this country. And I was shocked when he said that. And he said, we know what you've been doing here. We know you've been working with these other people. And our side, that the KGB side he alluded to, we are taking over and we're not going to allow people like you ever to come back. And I remember thinking, that was a very sobering conversation. His people did try to take over in August 1991, but they were thwarted. They were thwarted by the small d Democrats. His side lost. And in this round, my side won.
Now we come to that same moment that the U.S. makes a choice because the Soviet Union ends at the end of that year. Yeltsin becomes the new chief in charge of the whole of the country, although it's not clear what the whole country is. The
Right.
Soviet Empire is breaking into pieces. The money's no good. I know because I've talked to men at Azerbaijan who were there at that moment in Baku. They had no reserves. They had nothing. They had nothing forward. They didn't know what to do with their oil. It was that way across the country. But Yeltsin takes charge. And again, it's a moment where the U.S. and her allies have choices to make. Do we send a military in or do we send diplomats in? We chose diplomats again. Was it the right choice, Michael?
Yes, it was definitely the right choice. It was definitely the right choice to engage with Yeltsin, as President Bush did and then Clinton did afterwards. They didn't right away. President H.W. Bush held on to Gorbachev because he was somebody we knew well, and we feared the collapse of the Soviet Union because there were nuclear weapons in other parts of the Soviet Union at the time. We feared that at the time. But once it happened, he made the right decision to lean in, engage, support Yeltsin as a Democrat. I think the mistake we made, Democrats and Republicans both in the United States, is we just thought it was going to, they were going to become democratic and that it was the end of history, as my colleague here at Stanford, Frank Fukuyama, wrote very famously at the time. So we didn't invest into trying to make that happen. We just thought it was going to happen organically. Very different from what we did in World War II when we occupied Germany, we occupied Japan to help them build their democratic institutions. But because the reason we did that in 45 and we didn't in 91, 92 is because in 45 there was a lingering threat called the Soviet Union. And we knew that if we let these collapsed states on their own, they would be taken over by the communists. There wasn't that lingering threat to the east in 1991, 92. Had there been, had China been as powerful today as they back then as they are today, maybe we would have done more. But as a result, I think we were just too complacent. And I think had we put more effort in on both the political and economic side, we might have had different outcomes.
You write again and again, you're a liberal internationalist. I wasn't certain what that was before, but having now read your book, I am too, Michael. I confess it. Okay. So,
A bad term, though. We got to get better terminology. Yes.
okay, I'm McFaulite. Okay, here we go. All right. Bill Clinton's campaigning for the presidency in 92. He's successful. However, he makes remarks, repeated remarks in those early days that we have to look to our own domestic concerns and that the world now has a peace dividend. Was that the wrong direction at the time? Because it felt very logical given the campaign needs. Was there more that could have been done during that campaign between H.W. Bush, who was running for reelection, and Bill Clinton to be clear that we were going to do more for Russia? What I know it's 2020 hindsight, but you were there, Michael.
Yeah, that was a critical year. That was the first year of independence for Russia and Ukraine and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. All those countries were newly independent. And because the governor of Arkansas, his main slogan in 1992 was "It's the economy, stupid." That constrained what President Bush was prepared to do to help consolidate those democracies and those market economies. And there's just no doubt about it that the timing of that event, that 92 election, and the first year of independence in Russia was detrimental to consolidating the regime and the economy, the capitalist economy. Now, once President Clinton wins the election and is in power in 1993 as president, he gets this. He makes some big speeches about how we are in alliance with the ideas of democracy inside Russia. But by that time, it was too late. By the time he became president, the liberal reformist government led by Yegor Gaidar in 1992. And when I use the word liberal, I mean it in the classic sense. These are people that believed in freedom and democracy. They also believed in capitalism. They would have been very comfortable working as senior research scholars at the Hoover Institution. But they were already thrown out. They were already gone by the time 1993 came along. So that turned out to be a missed year that was, I think, rather consequential in terms of the history of Russia and U.S.-Russia relations.
One more detail because you were there. You went back to Russia as a representative of people interested in talking about democracy all the time, and you had a ready-made audience. That audience, was it at that point empowered or was it academics?
No, it was the government. It was 1992. I worked for something called the National Democratic Institute, which is one of the affiliates of something called the National Endowment for Democracy that Ronald Reagan established when he was president. And we were working directly with the author of the Constitution. We were, literally providing constitutional experts to talk about the pluses and minuses of a presidential system versus parliamentary, proportional representation as an electoral system versus the American system of first past the post. We worked with a lot of governors. There was such a demand for information. In fact, one of our most popular publications, John, was called How to Win Elections. It was a 6-volume study that we put out for politicians. And NDI, the group I worked for, we were affiliated with the Democratic Party, but our brochure was actually from the Republican Party. Extremely popular. And I think I'm glad you asked that question because we weren't there to foment revolution. We were invited by the Yeltsin government because they wanted to learn about democratic institutions at the time.
Want to establish, Michael, that Deng makes that transition into
Yep.
capitalism by the time that we're now dealing with, the 21st century. China is getting richer and richer and likes it, but it has a lot of details. Inside that richer and richer is resentment for at least a century, if not more.
Yes.
And that resentment is it something you've experienced because you've traveled in China before and after Xi? Was it always there or does Xi magnify it?
Well, that's a great question. It's called The Century of Humiliation in Chinese history books. And I think we in the West, and most certainly me, even when I began researching this book, did not understand the full magnitude of it, where the Western powers, the imperial powers came in and occupied territory, and the Japanese really came in, obviously, during World War II. But it was a time of weakness for China. And remember, this is a country that's been around for many, many centuries, has dominated Asia for many, many centuries. But the 19th century and the early 20th century was a time of extreme weakness that resulted in millions of people dying in World War II. And so when the Communist Party takes over in 49, and they do through force, right? It wasn't a free and fair election. They do so by force. They pledged to never allow China to be as weak again. And I think when you look at Xi Jinping today, that century of humiliation weighs on his mind. He does not want China to be in a weak spot. By the way, I don't think they are anymore. I never personally, that's a great question. I never personally experienced it. I was always been struck by, in my travels to China, and I spent a couple summers there uh, during the writing of this book, never felt that directed towards me personally, but directed towards the West, most certainly. And they want to be strong enough that it'll never happen again.
The concern that I have is to explain right now Xi Jinping's extreme concern, extreme attention to maintaining order in his own
Yes.
state. So much so that he's said to contribute to the contraction of the economy. Uh, was that always there? Was it there from Deng in the beginning? We just didn't see it because of all the successes, the keenness on controlling people, on dominating their lives.
So, yes and no. And it's a very complicated question. But I'm glad earlier in our conversation we were talking about Tiananmen Square in 1989. And there was a period in the 70s and 1976 and the Democracy Wall. There was this period in China that I think gets forgotten in America today, that there was pluralism, that there was a demand for democracy, and it was real. They had to squelch it on June 4th, 1989, but
Right.
it didn't go away in 89. I think that's another mythology, that it was bubbling along, and there was opening, and there were pluralism and non-governmental organizations after Tiananmen Square. It didn't all end that at that time. And that political opening created permissive conditions for the economic opening. They were intertwined, and there's some really great books that I read. Min Pei is one of them that writes about that opening of political opening allowed for economic opening. But what you see in China today under Xi Jinping is an erosion of both. So he is much more autocratic, in my view, than the previous three leaders of China, much more controlling. By the way, technology helps that. So that all the kind of monitoring technologies that you have available today that leaders like did not have before, he uses those. And second, as you hinted at, China grew economically because they became more like us. They opened up their markets. They became, capitalist. Capitalist ideas, market ideas were allowed. Xi Jinping is now moving away from that. And I think that is going to slow economic growth. They did not grow because of Communist Party ideas. They grew because of market ideas. And as he reintroduces more state control of the economy, I think it's going to slow down Chinese economic growth.
One more concern I have about China before we move on to Putinism. The concern is that China is a dynamic culture and that there are many challenges to Xi's strength and his concentration of power in his hands. Do we have the same concern? We have 30 seconds. If he goes, chaos that we had back in the days of Brezhnev and even Gorbachev. Do we worry about chaos anymore? Can you tell, Michael? 30 seconds.
We should definitely worry about chaos because it's a multi-ethnic society. It's an imperial reach to the hinterlands, and people are repressed and they want to be free. People in Hong Kong want to be free. The Uyghurs want to
Right.
be free. But I think that a peaceful process is still more likely than chaos.
We have three nuclear powers, all of whom have claimed to be powerful, the great states. And it's necessary to solve them on the basis of what Michael emphasizes is leadership. The leader of the Soviet, now Russian Federation, looks to be Vladimir Putin. And we need to understand what Putinism is, even if it's not about him, if it's about the effect of him. Michael, you're right. Putinism has to be concerned. You have to be concerned about it because it's a gambler. How so? What does that mean? How do we interpret that?
Well, Putin, he was an accidental president. Let's start with that. Talk about history. He was not some major opposition leader. He actually worked within the system in the 1990s. I first met him in 1991 when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Uh, he was a nondescript bureaucrat, but he was not opposed to all those leaders. But over time, he changed as president. He became increasingly anti-Western. He became, obviously, he was anti-democratic from the beginning, but over time he also became much more ideological, John. And I've watched it, I observed it, and then I saw it when I was in the government, where he believes that he is a defender of what he describes as Orthodox Christian values, and that the West is threatening those. And I just want to be clear, that's not my view, it's his view, it's the way he frames things. And over time, to defend those values and to defend Russian civilization, and he calls it that, he thinks Russia is a civilization, he has become more of a risk taker. With more limited capabilities than Xi Jinping in China or President Trump today, much more limited capabilities, but he's used them, and at times he achieved his objectives. So he invaded Georgia in 2008, kind of got away with it. He seized Crimea in 2014 and part of Ukraine, got away with it. Used his army, his air force in 2015 to prop up President Assad in Syria, and that worked for a while. Thankfully, it didn't work more recently. But he used the air force to prop up a dictator, an ally, and then, most ambitiously and tragically, he launched this full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That's a risk taker. That's somebody doing things that I think are risky. And by the way, are not, in my view, in Russia's national interest. I think he's damaging the well-being and security of his own people. But he's doing that because he's motivated by ideas and not just national interest.
Again, you were on the scene. Michael's the Selig of Russian affairs. You were on the scene in 2013, 2014, 2015. I believe they showed you the door in 2016. Is that correct? Or was it before that?
I left in 2014.
2014. You saw again the Russian state hesitate and to endorse Putin's decision to go into Crimea. Was it, upon reflection now, looking back, the U.S. and its allies did not respond to the Crimean occupation, the clear violation of sovereignty of Ukraine, did not respond in the way everyone responded in 22. Is there a way to reconsider that? What was the thinking at the time that Crimea is okay because it speaks Russian and the fleet's there. Donetsk and Luhansk are okay because they want to be Russian and they watch Russian TV. Was there that sort of rationalization, Michael?
Well, there was. So I left the government right before that invasion. So I was not in the government at the time, but I was most certainly interacting with the government and part of the debate more generally. I think we should have had a more robust response. We should have had more sanctions, and we should have provided arms to the Ukrainians so that they could deter a future intervention, a future invasion, as we saw tragically in 2022. And to that end, I applauded at the time, and I applaud today. President Trump did provide some weapons in a way that the Obama administration didn't. But I think the mistake is bigger than that. And I think you got to go back earlier because after Putin invaded Georgia, President George W. Bush, didn't impose any sanctions or provide any weapons, and nobody accused him of being, afraid from using military power. And I'm going to go back to 1956, and when the Soviets invaded Hungary, we didn't do enough. Czechoslovakia, 68, cracked down on solidarity in 81 when Ronald Reagan was president. There's a pattern here. But with respect to Putin, here's what I would say. I think it was the right bet to try to consolidate democracy and capitalism in Russia in the 1990s. I most certainly thought that at the time and participated in that, as we've already talked about. But I think in retrospect, we should have had a better hedge. That if things went badly, and they most certainly have gone really badly inside Russia, we should have had a plan B at the same time. And that plan B should have been to expand NATO faster than we did, because Russia, no Russian leader and no Soviet leader has ever attacked a NATO ally. And we should have provided more weapons to the countries in that gray zone, right? Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine. Had we provided, think about the counterfactual, had we provided 20 years ago the weapons that we provided today, I think the Ukrainians would have been able to deter an invasion of their country because Putin would have had to calculate the costs would have been a lot higher. So that I think was the mistake we made. And in that list, I include the administration I served in, but also the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and the first Trump administration. President Trump, he likes to say there never would have been a war if I was president. But that's just not true. There was a war the entire time he was president in Ukraine. It went on for 4 years. Lots of people died. Lots of Ukrainians died. We should have had a more robust response to that initial war for sure.
Your book has a theme that I want to pay attention to. It's so consistent throughout it. It's where is democracy now? Where is autocracy now? There's a moment you acknowledge that some states have taken the wrong lessons from moves like Putin's in 14, which is that autocracy is to be preferred because you get things done. Is,
Yes.
is that is that growing in popularity or shrinking in popularity after the Putin example around the world? Well, we're generalizing.
Yes. Oh, no, it's growing for sure. It's growing because of Putinism. And Putinism, as I write in the book, I think we underestimated his appeal, especially in Europe and the United States. He invested a lot to promote his ideas of illiberal populist nationalism. And he's got lots of followers in Hungary, Italy, the UK, France, and here in the United States. Likewise, the Chinese model of economic development is popular, especially in the developing world, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East. And they just say, let the state run things and we get things done. And as you know, there's a pretty big debate here in the United States about how we're just inefficient. There's too much bureaucracy. There's too many veto points. And I agree with that criticism of how we make policy. But, here in California, there's too much of that, and it stifles growth. And so this debate between autocrats and Democrats is real. My solution is not autocracy. I don't want us to be more like the Chinese to grow. My solution is more competition, more innovation. I believe that those are America's strong suits. But analytically, the data is very clear that those ideas are growing in popularity, and democracy as a set of ideas is still popular, but is not as popular as it was 30 years ago.
The facts are way on me. And so I want to go to a scene. I like scenes, Michael, because
Yeah,
you enter into the opera halfway through.
right.
It's Mar-a-Lago, first Trump term. Xi Jinping is in Florida. There are photographs in the front of the building. And later on, we're told when they serve chocolate cake, Mr. Mr. Trump conveyed in some fashion that he just fired missiles into Syria. This is the Assad Syria undergoing civil war at the time. It didn't resolve anything, but it was missiles and chocolate cake that I remember. This is Donald Trump learning Xi Jinping and vice versa. Now, Xi Jinping is a man who resents his childhood and what was done to his father, a princeling. He was repressed by Mao and the center of the Communist Party for many years, stripped him of his authority and humiliated him. That was the Cultural Revolution. Xi himself was banished to the countryside. He tells us he lived in a cave, he lived with the peasants. A lot of reason to resent, but he turned into the aggressor. Today, he brutalizes people such as the in Xinjiang, for example, the Uyghur.
Yes.
He brutalizes the people in Hong Kong. He brutalizes everywhere. Trump knows this when he's sitting down him at Mar-a-Lago. What do you make of Donald Trump's handling of Xi Jinping? Is it appropriate to be autocratically when you're dealing with an autocrat? Does it work, Michael?
Again, really great question, tough question that I'm going to have only partial answers to. Most certainly, when dealing with Xi Jinping, we want to be strong. Ronald Reagan had a phrase, peace through strength. I think that's exactly right. And we want to show strength. That's why we tragically, but necessarily, have to expand our military budget. I support the president on that. And when he showed force and the ability to use force, as that story that you just told, that's a good thing for the United States, not a bad thing. We want to show our adversaries that we have these capabilities. Second, this is more controversial, but I applaud President Trump's engagement with Xi Jinping. We have to deal with our adversaries. We have to communicate directly through them, with them, and even with Putin, I support that, and with Xi Jinping, they met recently. That's important as a way to manage the world between adversaries, between great powers. But third, where I disagree with the president, is I think in order to deal with autocrats like Xi Jinping, we need the Democrats to be aligned against them. And I think we're doing too much damage to our allies right now. We need our allies in Asia and our allies in Europe to be united behind us, not doubting us. And I think the president needs to work harder on that. And then finally, when he does meet with people like Xi Jinping and Putin, but especially Xi Jinping, I just wish the president, like Ronald Reagan did so masterfully, would talk a little bit more about human rights. Uh, you're not going to convince Xi Jinping to become a Democrat. That's not going to happen. But you can, by when dealing with autocrats like that, when talking about those issues, inspire the small d Democrats living under tyranny, in places like Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, inspire people worried about being threatened by them, like the people living on the island of Taiwan. I was just there recently, and I know that they need that inspiration. And I just think you can do both of those things. And I wish he'd just put a little more emphasis on the values part while he's engaging with people like Xi Jinping.
Staying with your theme, is there a democracy voice in China today? Does it breathe free, or is it having to hide under the covers?
There is a voice for freedom in China. I meet those people from time to time, but they're hiding under the covers. This is a time because it's become more autocratic. The risks to your livelihood, the risk to just keeping out of jail are much greater today than they were just 15 or 20 years ago.
I mentioned Jimmy Lai. You know the story very well.
Yes, I know his
Publisher,
son. Yes,
publisher of Apple Daily. I believe it's 5 years now he's been detained with
yes.
charges that are basically he believed in freedom of publication. Okay, there it is. Now, that is an example of what she makes of our understanding of democracy. But at the same time, Jimmy Lai has become a symbol. Is it useful to be a symbol, to suffer the way he does, but to be a symbol for democracy in China? Are people listening?
Well, it's not useful to him. I wish he would be free. And I just met recently with his son, and I applaud the efforts to keep him in the news. I applaud your efforts, John, right now to mention Jimmy Lai. This is atrocious. It should not happen, and it should get a lot more attention. And it's an example of something that President Trump should have talked about his case when he just met with Xi Jinping. Ronald Reagan did that. George W. Bush did that. Barack Obama did it. I was in the room when he would bring up cases of repression of Russian dissidents and Russian business leaders, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Doesn't mean you're going to achieve success right away, but you cannot forget them. But I do think it does inspire people inside China, and therefore, the more that we can bring attention to these kinds of cases of repression, I think that is good for all small d Democrats, both inside China but also Hong Kong, but also Taiwan, and also in other parts of the world. The autocrats that you've been hinting at, right? They're united. Russia, China, and Iran, North Korea. They have a self-help alliance system. You know, Putin invades Ukraine and he gets drones from the Iranians, he gets soldiers from the North Koreans, he gets money from the Chinese. We small d Democrats need to be more aligned and in more solidarity, including those small d Democrats that are imprisoned by the autocrats.
Right now, we have a time of crisis in Russia in the early 21st century, and we don't know how it's going to come out. Michael has recommendation that Democrats in Russia are listening, and so they'll pay attention to how Michael's book is heard by the American people. And voices such as Michael speak out against what Vladimir Putin has rendered his country. Tens of thousands. We have no idea how many damaged families there are. We just don't know.
That's right.
We could only guess. But there is something to be done in the meantime. Russia is not integrated into the world trade system. It could have been, it was, but right now it's being decoupled from the system chiefly because it no longer can count on its energy being bought by the Europeans. What can be done with Russia now and looking to the future? Michael, this is the part of your book I most enjoyed because you're speculating about part of this century that I will not see, 2050 and beyond. And I'm counting on you to be there, Michael. So to answer questions about what you see, what can be done given that Vladimir Putin is a man who looks to be in charge, and yet there is a story, I hear it repeatedly, that he is not all that powerful because he's frightened of his right wing. His right wing is understood to be not just nationalists, but supremacists who are ready to use nuclear weapons at any moment. What can be done with an autocracy that is so sealed and yet it's so dangerous to our European allies and to world peace?
Well, most immediately, we can help Ukraine win. That would be good for Ukraine and it'd be good for small d Democrats and liberal minded people inside Russia. There's just no doubt in my mind about that. And I'll tell you two stories about it. I've been in the room with Vladimir Putin many times when I was in the government. And one time I heard him say that we're different than you Americans. You know, he actually looked at his skin. He was meeting with Vice President Biden, and he said, you know, your problem, you guys, you look at us, and because we look like you think that we think like you, but we don't. We're different than you. That's his argument back home for why he needs a strong dictatorship, strong hand to rule Russia. But he also says that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. I've heard him say that many times. They're just part of the Russian nation, artificially divided by us, first by the Bolsheviks, by the way, in 1917, then by the CIA, in his view, in 1991. But if Ukrainians are practicing democracy and freedom, that undermines his argument about why they need dictatorship in Russia. So I think consolidating democracy at the end of this war, even if it means some territory might be occupied by the Russians for a while, that will inspire change on the eastern side. By the way, not unlike what happened during the Cold War, where in 1989, those living under tyranny decided we'd rather be part of the prosperous West Germany instead of the autocratic East Germany. And they literally walked across that end of the Cold War. I can imagine an opportunity like that in the future. So help Ukraine win, more weapons, more sanctions, so that this war can finally end. To your other point about the fascists, though, in Russia, they have real fascists. That's true. We don't know how powerful they are because we don't have good opinion polling, but they are strong, and they've gotten stronger as a result of this war because they now believe that the world is out to get them, and Putin's weak. That's the argument they make. He's not strong enough. He's not fighting back. And I don't know what will happen in the post-Putin era, and I don't believe anybody that predicts it. But I do think there'll be a struggle between the liberals that want to get back with integrating and these much more nationalistic forces inside Russia.
That takes us back, doesn't it? The lessons learned of 62, of 91, of 89 in China, 91 in Moscow. They'll come again and again when we are faced with what the plan B. If Putin goes, what do we do? Do we have an answer yet, Michael?
Well, I write about it in the book. Let's not lose the peace. I think we did that in Russia. And my answer is not to have illusions that we can foment revolution inside China and Russia. I just don't think we have the means to do that now. And we should be modest in the efforts and our capabilities right now. But when there is a breakthrough, led by Chinese and Russians, not led by us, we have to embrace that moment. We have to engage that moment. We have to support the new democratic governments of Russia and China to a much greater extent than we did in 1991. That was an opportunity lost. We can't lose it again.
I come to your recommendation that I was most attracted to, which is to be inviting to the talent. We know that the talent of Russia started fleeing the moment the war started in 22. They're in Yerevan, they're in Baku. I've seen them in Baku.
Oh,
Russian,
wow.
whole rows of Russian restaurants opening in Baku. They're especially in Istanbul, especially because they got out knowing that they weren't going to have their lives. These are well-trained young people, entrepreneurs. We can continue to attract them. Can we do more to attract them? Can we reverse this crazy? I don't know. I don't want to characterize it. There's an odd visa policy right now, and
Yes.
I believe that that does not open the door to the talent that could come here. Do I say that correctly, Professor?
Absolutely. And that's a great lesson from the Cold War, a success from the Cold War that we have to replicate. We managed through our immigration policy, to attract the smartest, most talented people in the world from everywhere, especially from those communist societies, right? They're some of the biggest companies where I live here in the Silicon Valley were created by some of those people. Sergey Brin, he came from the Soviet Union because we had an immigration policy to attract those people here. He's one of the founders of Google. And we need to continue that strategy again, and we're not doing it. We're not bringing in those people. We're not making it easy for asylum seekers to come. And now with this new $100,000 charge for H-1B visas that the Trump administration has put in place, I suffer from it myself at my institute that I run. We had somebody we were bringing from the UK, and they got caught in this H-1B thing, and we don't have the money to pay $100,000 to support that visa. And that means this incredibly talented individual that could be contributing to Stanford will not be here. And that's just a micro story of just many, many people that we're losing. And this was our great strength back in the Cold War, that people wanted to come to America. They didn't want to go to Moscow. They didn't want to go to Beijing. And we still have that advantage over Beijing and Moscow today, but we're starting to lose it. And the Chinese Communist Party and the institutions that they control, they're throwing a lot of money at very talented scientists and professors right now to come to Beijing, come to Shanghai. That technological competition, that's going to be what it's all about in the 21st century. We have just got to have a smarter strategy, or we're going to lose to the Chinese.
You also mentioned about this no limits partnership between Xi and Putin. What can be done not to separate them, but at least to make them doubt each other? Is there any way we can weaken Russia that way?
I think yes, but with modest expectations, because Xi Jinping and Putin are close personally. They're dictatorships, and they're against the West. And what brings them together is their fear of us and our ideas, not our weapons, our ideas. So that's going to be hard to mess with. That said, I do see fissures. Xi Jinping does not support Vladimir Putin at the UN General Assembly when they vote. When there are resolutions condemning the invasion of Ukraine, he abstains. I think he doesn't want to destroy the international order because China benefits it from it. And I think, therefore, we should use those windows of opportunity to pull the Chinese away from Russia. We're not going to completely separate them. That would be folly. But I think there's more that we could do, especially to reduce the technology flowing from China into Russia and the money from oil and gas sales flowing into Russia that helps Putin conduct his war in Ukraine.
Xi Jinping in Beijing, who is in his eighth decade, and it's time to think about retirement. And Vladimir Putin in his eighth decade. I'm in my eighth decade. You think about retirement, it's natural. So if and when they retire, what needs to be done to prepare their countries for a better outcome? China looks to have the most handholds, trade and coupling with the West on all manner of production, and they need our money. They just need it. They depend upon it. They have an export-only model with a crater for a housing department. So this looks to be opening to us. Is it, Michael? Your ideas are so tempting. Is it happening?
Well, I hope I do in the book try to spell out a grand strategy for decades to come. It's not just a book for the next couple of years. And when I add up the power and then on autocrats versus Democrats, I still want to be on the side of the Democrats. I still think when it comes to military power, if we have our allies together, we're much stronger than the autocrats. When it comes to economic power, yes, the Chinese are growing, but you bring the free world together. 9 of the 10 largest economies in the world are democracies. We're still stronger there. We still have stronger universities by far, including my own at Stanford. We still have more valuable companies compared to the Chinese and the Russians. GDP per capita, it's not even close. We're always at the top. Russia and China are in the kind of mid 50s. I don't think they'll ever catch up with us. And then when it comes to ideational power, despite all of the troubles that we've been talking about, our ideas are still better. The world still agrees with Winston Churchill that democracy is a horrible system of government, except for all the others tried. And opinion polls show that most people around the world, not all, but most people around the world would rather vote in their leaders and choose their leaders than have a communist party, a colonel, a bunch of guys with beards claiming to talk for God. I'm speaking of the Iranians there, or a thug like Putin choose who should be their leader. So I think when it comes to military, economic, ideational power, we're stronger, but we have to be more united. If we're going to compete, we have got to be in a self-help society like we were during the Cold War. That was our great advantage in the Cold War, that we united the capitalist world. We built strong allies and alliances like NATO, and then we invested in institutions to promote ideas of democracy. U.S. Agency for International Development, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, National Endowment for Democracy. Those were all fantastic institutions created during the Cold War that we're not investing in now. And I think the blueprint is bring the Democrats together and then support democratic ideas. And by the way, get our own democracy here at home in order. That makes us, the beacon of emulation that we once were. We get that together, and I think we'll be okay.
And yet you immediately suggest to me what I haven't paid attention to because it's so unhappy. Our democracy is wobbling.
Yes.
Is that something that can be corrected with one or two elections, or is this a long-term problem that's been happening, reaching back to the 20th century? We just didn't see it.
Well, analytically, we are definitely wobbling. That's a great word. And scholars and organizations that score democracy in America, that's a consensus view. My own view, and I write about it in the book, is that our elites are actually much more polarized than the American people are. I'm from Montana. I've family members that voted for President Trump. But when we sit down and talk, we agree on like 95% of what unites us. I think we're a lot more purple than red and blue. My high school debate partner, by the way, John, he's a friend of mine. His name is Steve Daines, Senator Steve Daines,
Uh,
from the red state of Montana. Same thing with Steve. I just think there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. And I think we need some leaders that talk in those terms. So that's number one. I have a whole bunch of institutional reforms in the book, but without leaders, that won't come about. But I'm an optimist. I think, I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get out of this polarizing, fighting time. Because at the end of the day, I think more Americans would rather talk to each other than fight with each other.
there are some practical ideas, though, that we can do with besides just waiting for
Yes.
the worm to turn. One of them is to deal with this present problem of trade. The administration has an idea that I've not seen supported anywhere so far, including before the Supreme Court, that trade can be derived in the hands of the president from a law passed in 1977. It seems like a very thin line that they're giving us, and I'm not satisfied with it. But our adversaries see this. Do we strengthen them when we act so divided over something so obviously wrong direction? Trade?
Well, first, I'm with you on the rather exotic interpretation of that law to give the power to the president. And generally, I believe in checks and balances. I think our the folks that wrote the Constitution were worried about kings, and so they put a bunch of checks and balances in the Constitution, and I support that. I think that's when we're at our best. I worry about concentration of power because I've seen it in other countries, and I've seen the damage that one party's ruling everything and one executive having all power. That's what happened to Russia, and it destroyed that country. And therefore, we should move against it. With respect to trade, we made some mistakes in opening up too fast, bringing the Chinese in. I go through that history in detail in the book. But my response is reform it, don't blow it up. We will not succeed if we think that we can become an oasis unto ourselves by putting up all these trade barriers to especially our allies. That's just not the 21st century. And I think it's dangerous to think that we can do that. And I would encourage people to study the 1930s when we tried to do that, and it didn't work out too well.
The turn here is, does Moscow smile when they see our
Oh, I forgot that part. Of course. Oh my gosh. Do they smile? They love it when they see us fighting amongst ourselves. January 6, 2021, if you look at their press, when we're fighting amongst ourselves, we're not focused on Moscow and Beijing, and we're weaker. And that is just the facts. And when we're united, that worries Moscow and Beijing and other autocratic regimes around the world.
I was told a story once, this is in the early part of this century, that the America desk at the Kremlin was being moved to a back corner, not being listened to. Is the Liberal International desk being moved to the back corner for now, and there'll be a better day ahead? Is that can I hold on to that, Michael?
Well, I think that's right. It's definitely in the back corner somewhere because liberal internationalism and cooperating in multilateral institutions, building allies, these are not popular ideas either in the White House or in America. I want to be clear about that. But that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book. Maybe people will just read this and say I'm some dinosaur from the past. I'm willing to accept that criticism, but I want to make the case to the American people by why we're better off engaging in the world than pulling back. We're better off cooperating in multilateral ways than just going it alone. And we're better off supporting ideas of freedom, liberty, and democracy, both because they're good ideas, but also it advances our national interests than just pretending that all that matters in the world is power. And it doesn't mean we're going to go back to the old, the glory days of 1991. That's not going to happen. We have to have a forward-looking agenda. But I think that agenda is there, and that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I'm so glad to talk about it with you, John.
Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the new global disorder. Michael McFaul. I'm John Batchelor.